Well, Dr. Mestenhauser, I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit about what's currently leading the field of internationalization.
Well, I think it's the quality of leadership that we have. And that's kind of neglected because leadership itself is culture-bound for individual cultures and countries. In the case of the U.S., for example, there has been a major change of upgrading international education from basically directors, which is the function that I had, and there was a much lower on the totem pole of the university functioning. So now we have associate provost or associate vice presidents, and they presumably have access then to other vice presidents and other deans, and certainly the president. So the reason why it's leadership driven is something that the American Council of Education counted already in this early 60s out here, and I somehow took notice of that too, because when I was in the Philippines on my Fulbright, that was my subject of my study. It never did get concluded because Marcos took over.
Right.
My publisher got arrested. All his stuff got confiscated.
Yeah.
And so on. I had about 3 or 4 drafts of that book that I was producing that I gave out, to some of my friends, and they have been actually using it too, because the concept of leadership was not particularly known very well in the Philippines. They knew the concept of the chiefs and so on, but the leadership as an abstract form was not available. The reason why leadership is needed is because international education started out as a kind of education of the individual. That was very consistent with our democratic values.
Right.
You want to develop individual people, and that certainly is something I don't oppose or anything. I certainly value highly. But the problem is that there is a concept that has to be institutionalized. And, that is one of the problems, because if you look at the leadership structure, that even if the international vice president is at the highest level there too, it may not always be possible to push through requirements that cut across the institution, particularly those that reflect on the curriculum. And that's where, and the deans generally are there for basically shorter time. They are not necessarily permanent. They often change with the new administrations and so forth. And they are basically academics who don't want to be away from their departments for too long. And they still consider themselves the disciplinarians rather than anything broader than that.
Right.
So the vice president has a tough job, to do that. And yet, I don't know any other way except to elevate the position of the vice presidents even higher, and give it an instructional function.
Right.
So it will be sort of like a parallel to the structure of the university, and that individual would have to have some budget to hire and fire people, because the departments don't necessarily hire people with international or intercultural competencies.
Right.
They just hire them basically on the mainstream of the disciplines.
Yeah.
And so the other reason why leadership is so essential is because international education is global, of course, and so they have to be attuned to everything else that's going on.
Right.
And what is going on is just a revolution almost every place.
Yeah.
I see that in Europe. I see that especially in Asia, East Asia, and Pacific. There is a new organization initiated by the Koreans China is also involved in new coalitions there too, and certainly in Africa, the South Africans are also kind of exploding with new ideas about what should be done,
Right.
and have a major problem because much of the support is only coming from the Westerners, so it's kind of associated with the post-colonial mentality.
Right.
And one of my South African friends with whom I worked has just published kind of a concept paper, a very brief one, about internationalizing international education itself. Because they feel they are behind, they kind of blame the Westerners for not bringing them up to date, and are seeking equality on sort of conceptual level.
Right.
So that also requires leadership,
Mm-hmm.
and that leadership requires kind of different international knowledge, that you assume people should have when they go abroad to do certain jobs and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And my concept of leadership, of course, is cross-cultural, because that's what I did, and I discovered, studying it in the Philippines, very distinct references to their culture, and the culture, in fact, has gone back to 600 years without change. That has been just an incredible finding for me. And I did quite a bit of lecturing. I have not really written anything until in my recent book, and I suggested some changes that I just repeated here now.
Yeah. So, if I may, so it sounds like as you conceive of leadership within internationalization, it has a conceptual level that people need to understand that culture is.
That's right.
That leadership is cultural bound. But then there's also a cultural element institutionally, too, within universities. And then it sounds like it's also linked to your ideas of knowledge being very culture-bound. And as you
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Excellent.
Yes, indeed.
Could you say a little bit more about your concept of leadership as cultural? What else goes into it? So you were saying that individuals need to understand the cultures that they're working in, but could you say a little bit more about your definition of leadership?
Well, the typical definition of leadership is the ability to persuade people to produce more in a particular organizational setting.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very instrumental, you see.
Mm-hmm.
But leadership is more than just being instrumental in managing people.
Right.
That's what management does, basically.
Yeah.
But I think of leadership as a kind of higher level of concept.
Mm.
It's an abstract concept. And the way that I got to this position is when I returned to Czechoslovakia after the communists got thrown out.
Yeah.
I gave a lecture on this, and I was just bombed out, nobody understood me.
Yeah.
And then I realized, that they had been so indoctrinated by the communist regime.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a kind of a cultural impact as well, because communism was a culture, and a very thick one at that too.
Mm-hmm.
That they associated leadership with not the abstract term, but specific concrete people.
Yeah. Yeah.
President of a group in the communist era, it was the functionaries of the Communist Party,
Right. Right.
And so I started doing some reading about the concept that communism itself had about leadership, and I didn't find any. So finally, leadership was associated with administration and bureaucracy. So that was kind of a negative term, because they wanted to relate to people.
Yeah.
But the only other one was that the Communist Party is the leader of the proletariat.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that was a very powerful concept, for them, of course.
Absolutely.
Because they were taking advantage of it and reminded people all the time that the party is the leader.
Right. Right.
And of course, it created tremendous dependencies on other people, and it was very hierarchical
Right.
and power-driven. So, in leadership, some of the cultural variables are exactly the nature of social power in the groups. Establishment of goals for the organization. In the business literature, it's neglected, because leadership assumes that the goals have already been established. So when you get hired, you don't have an option to say something about the goals of the corporation or something like that.
Right.
And the same is true in education. I think that education, I think that the major concern for this leadership-driven thing is to keep developing people. And, that does require then also some knowledge of pedagogy, and how information is being processed by people's minds and so on, and what the mindsets are. The problem, I think, is that most people who watch television every day, news and so on, think they know what's going on in the world.
Right.
And so they don't need any extra information. That's the mindset. And what it is that they know about the world is very scampy and completely inadequate and fragmented. So what's needed, of course, is to elevate that kind of thinking to a higher level of thinking where people actually use knowledge to reason out what is happening and what their roles should be.
Right.
One other reason for the leadership is the fact that I observe is that it cannot prevent wars, although there's some strong pacifistic lines in the theory of international education, going back to the probably World War I already, and so on. But the rest of it is just strictly instrumental out here. But if you cannot prevent the war, international cross-cultural education particularly should have a lot of roles to play after the cessation of hostilities.
Right.
And, they almost always call for exchanges of people. So, I think that we also need to have the kind of leadership that understands what happened to people who are coming from this kind of distress.
Right.
And, for me, it was true in Czechoslovakia as well. I returned there almost immediately after the communists got thrown out, and I have seen and heard the impact of the thinking that the communist indoctrination had. And I actually interviewed former communists, interviewed the people who taught Marxism, for example, as well.
Yeah.
And so I realized that there has been a tremendous impact, and still is today. Still is today. I still feel it too. But most American consultants never understood that. I was just amazed. I encountered a group of American political scientists. When the doors opened, they just migrated there all the time.
Yeah.
Some of them actually took over the parliament.
Really?
And sat in the commissions and wrote legislation for them. And the Czechs didn't know how to deal with that because they thought, oh, God, we are really getting something up to date.
Right.
So my example of that is the law that they succeeded in passing about employment. So, previously employment was regulated by party membership.
Yeah, it was guaranteed.
And you could not get promoted unless you were a party member and so on. But so the purpose of that law was to eliminate that. And so they required academic training of some kind for public service particularly. and no party membership, that was clearly eliminated, but experience also.
Right.
So guess who had experience? Were the communists.
Yeah.
Guess who had the degrees, who got
The communists.
admitted to the universities? Were the communists.
Yeah.
So the country actually has to re-employ people whom they fired,
Right.
who were communists.
Yeah.
And based on that law,
Uh-huh.
so they created more havoc than to, and they never understood that. In fact, when I was trying to argue with them that communism was a culture of its own and that you have to
Yeah.
essentially change that culture, they accused me of being a communist myself.
Really?
For me, for communists, ever since I was 14.
Yes.
So that was rather hard to take.
Yeah. So it really seems that, it comes back to this theme that we've been talking about. It's that mindset again, and having that awareness beyond
Mindset
yourself.
was there too. And they did that with a great enthusiasm, know. Yeah, and they thought, before they left, what good work they have done
Right.
there.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Mestenhauser. This has been very, very informative.
Yeah.